The morning sun filtered through the trees as I made my daily trek across my backyard to my specially constructed shed. Most of my neighbors probably assumed it contained the usual suburban collection of lawn equipment and holiday decorations. They had no idea that behind those unassuming walls existed my greatest passion, a sophisticated, climate-controlled snake breeding facility that I had built over the past 7 years. I unlocked the 3 separate security locks and stepped inside, immediately checking the digital monitoring system that tracked temperature, humidity, and light cycles for each habitat zone. Everything read perfect: 82 degrees in the main breeding area, 90 degrees in the specialized incubation chamber, and humidity holding steady at 65%. The gentle hum of the environmental systems formed a soothing background noise that always helped calm my mind after a long day at the office. My collection consisted of 17 different species of non-venomous snakes, primarily focused on ball pythons, corn snakes, and king snakes. Each snake lived in a carefully designed habitat with proper hide boxes, water dishes, and enrichment features suited to their specific needs. This was not some haphazard collection of reptiles. This was a methodical breeding program for which I held all proper permits, licenses, and certifications. I moved carefully through the narrow walkway between habitat racks, misting certain enclosures and refreshing water in others. In the corner habitat, Athena, my prized piebald ball python breeding female, raised her head curiously as I approached. She represented 3 years of selective breeding and a significant financial investment. Her unique coloration pattern made her offspring highly sought after by legitimate collectors and reptile enthusiasts. "Good morning, beautiful girl," I said softly as I refreshed her water bowl. Athena flicked her tongue, sensing my presence before settling back into her favorite hide box. Her clutch of eggs was due in approximately 3 weeks, a delicate time when environmental stability was absolutely crucial. I continued my morning routine, checking on each snake, maintaining detailed records in my breeding logbook, and preparing the frozen mice that would be thawed for the evening feeding schedule. Every aspect of this operation required precision, consistency, and specialized knowledge. The average person had no concept of how delicate the environmental balance needed to be for successful breeding. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had initially questioned my shed when I first built it 5 years ago, but my permits were in order, and the structure complied with all local building codes and HOA aesthetic requirements. The exterior was painted the approved sage green color, the structure remained under the height limitations, and I maintained immaculate landscaping around it to ensure it integrated seamlessly with the property. For years, my breeding operation had continued without incident. My phone chimed with a notification that interrupted my morning ritual. HOA special meeting, attendance mandatory, Tuesday 7:00 p.m. new board president introduction. I sighed, scrolling through the detailed message. Rumors had been circulating through the neighborhood about the newly elected HOA president, a local real estate agent named Karen Matthews who had moved in 6 months ago and immediately began campaigning for a board position. Several neighbors had already received violation notices for infractions as minor as garbage cans left at the curb 2 hours too long or unapproved flower varieties planted in front gardens. The atmosphere in our once peaceful community had grown tense, with neighbors exchanging worried glances and hushed conversations at community mailboxes. I took one final look around my meticulously maintained breeding facility before leaving for work. The specialized incubation equipment hummed efficiently, maintaining the precise conditions necessary for healthy egg development. The automatic misting system was programmed to activate at scheduled intervals throughout the day. The backup generator stood ready in case of power failure. Every detail had been considered and implemented with professional care. I had no way of knowing that this peaceful morning would be the last normal day in my breeding operation. I secured each lock on the shed door, testing them one final time before heading to my car, completely unaware that within 24 hours, everything I had built would be placed in serious jeopardy. The community center parking lot was unusually full when I arrived on Tuesday evening. I recognized most of the vehicles: the Johnson family minivan, Mr. Patel's electric car, the Wilson's SUV, but there were also several unfamiliar luxury cars parked in the spots closest to the entrance. The atmosphere inside felt charged with uncomfortable energy as neighbors nodded tightly to one end. Other speaking in hushed tones that immediately ceased when the door at the front of the room opened. Karen Matthews entered like she was walking onto a stage rather than into a community HOA meeting. Her blonde hair was styled in an immaculate bob, not a strand out of place. She wore a tailored navy blazer with a bold gold pin shaped like a house on the lapel. Her smile seemed practiced, revealing perfectly whitened teeth as she surveyed the room like a general assessing a battlefield. "Good evening, Oak Ridge Estates homeowners," she announced without waiting for the traditional introduction from the outgoing president. "For those who have not had the pleasure of meeting me yet, I am Karen Matthews, your new Homeowners Association president, and more importantly, the premier real estate agent for luxury properties in this county." She gestured to a younger woman who hurried to connect a laptop to the projector. "Before we address regular HOA business, I want to share my vision for our community." The lights dimmed, and a professional slideshow appeared on the wall, featuring before and after photos of houses and neighborhoods. "These are communities similar to ours where I have helped implement strategic property value enhancement initiatives," Karen continued, clicking through images of homes being renovated, lawns being landscaped, and property features being removed or replaced. "Under my guidance, property values in these neighborhoods increased by an average of 22% within 18 months. An older resident, Mr. Garcia, raised his hand. "Excuse me, but some of these changes look expensive. Are you suggesting mandatory renovations? Many of us are on fixed incomes." Karen's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "What I am suggesting, sir, is that certain minimum standards be enforced more rigorously. Your property value affects mine, and I am simply not willing to allow my investment to be compromised by properties that project the wrong image." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a spreadsheet of violation notices organized by category. "In my initial assessment of our community, I have identified 173 bylaw violations that have been overlooked by previous boards. Starting next week, formal notices will be issued." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Mrs. Wilson from 3 doors down raised her hand. "What kinds of violations are we talking about? Most of us have lived here for years without issues." "Unauthorized structures, unapproved landscape elements, improper storage, suspicious activities," Karen listed briskly. As she said the word suspicious activities, her gaze fixed directly on me. The meeting continued for another hour, with Karen introducing 3 new board members, all recent arrivals to the neighborhood and all sharing her aggressive vision for community improvement. When the meeting finally opened for general comments, few residents spoke up. The tension in the room was palpable, and Karen's dismissive responses to the few who did raise concerns made it clear that disagreement would not be tolerated. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my things and headed toward the exit, hoping to avoid any direct interaction. I was not successful. "You are the owner of the property on Maple Drive with the large shed, correct?" Karen asked, stepping directly into my path. Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were cold and evaluating. "Yes, that is my property," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "And what exactly do you store in that structure? It seems unusually large for standard homeowner needs." She glanced at a tablet in her hand, presumably reviewing property records. "I have all proper permits and approvals for that structure," I answered carefully. "It was approved by the HOA 5 years ago when it was built." "Yes, well, previous boards were perhaps less diligent in their oversight responsibilities," Karen said with a tight smile. "We will be conducting property inspections to ensure all structures are being used appropriately and do not pose any hazards to the community." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Any inspection would need to be scheduled in advance. The shed contains sensitive equipment. "Sensitive equipment," Karen repeated, her eyebrow raising. "For what purpose exactly?" "I breed reptiles," I stated simply, seeing no reason to hide my legitimate business. "Non-venomous snakes specifically. I have all proper licensing and permits." The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. Her face contorted briefly in disgust before she regained her composed facade. Snakes in a residential neighborhood. Yes, completely legally and safely, I affirmed. As I mentioned, I have all proper. We will be reviewing this situation thoroughly, she interrupted, taking a step back as if I might have snakes in my pockets. Expect an official communication from the HOA shortly. Over the next several days, I noticed increased activity around my house. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now seemed hesitant to make eye contact. Unfamiliar cars drove slowly past my property. And exactly 1 week after the meeting, an official letter arrived in my mailbox, bearing the HOA letterhead and Karen's flourishing signature at the bottom. The letter requested immediate access for inspection of all structures on the property at 347 Maple Drive, with specific attention to the detached outbuilding and its contents. The inspection was scheduled for the following Monday at 10:00 a.m. when they knew I would be at work. The final paragraph contained the thinly veiled threat that failure to comply may result in immediate enforcement actions as permitted under Section 7.3 of the HOA Covenant. I held the letter in my trembling hands, recognizing it for what it was, not a routine inspection request, but the opening move in what would become an escalating battle for my property rights and the survival of my breeding program. Karen had identified her target, and for reasons I did not yet fully understand, she had decided that target was me. The morning after receiving the inspection notice, I called the HOA office to explain my situation. The receptionist informed me that Karen was unavailable but promised to relay my message, requesting a rescheduled inspection when I could be present to explain the specialized equipment and the importance of maintaining the controlled environment. I followed up with an email detailing the sensitive nature of my breeding facility, attaching copies of my business license, specialized reptile breeding permits, and even my membership certification from the International Herpetological Society. My message emphasized the importance of proper protocols when entering the shed to avoid disrupting the carefully maintained environments or stressing the animals. Karen's response arrived that evening, a terse 3 sentences stating that the inspection would proceed as scheduled, that HOA board members do not require supervision to assess covenant compliance, and that I should make appropriate arrangements if I had concerns. No acknowledgement of my permits or the specialized nature of the facility was included. The next day, I contacted 2 board members I knew from previous neighborhood events, hoping to find a reasonable voice. Both seemed uncomfortable discussing the matter, with one finally admitting that Karen had described my breeding operation as a potential health hazard and a neighborhood liability during a private board session. Frustrated but unwilling to risk escalation by refusing the inspection outright, I installed a small security camera near the shed door that would send alerts to my phone if movement was detected. I also placed prominent warning signs about the sensitive environmental controls and detailed instructions on the inner door, explaining that equipment should not be touched or moved under any circumstances. Monday morning, I left for work with a sense of unease. I had done everything possible to communicate the specialized nature of my facility and the potential consequences of improper handling. All I could do now was hope that professional responsibility would prevail over Karen's obvious prejudice against my hobby. At 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a security alert. The inspection was not scheduled until 10:00 a.m., but my camera showed Karen and 2 other board members already approaching my shed. I immediately called Karen's cell phone, which went to voicemail. I tried the HOA office and was told she was in the field conducting inspections. I watched helplessly through the remote camera feed as Karen removed a set of keys from her pocket. My blood ran cold. There was no legitimate reason for her to have keys to my property. I quickly texted my neighbor, Michael, who worked from home, asking if he could check what was happening. "They are entering your shed right now," Michael texted back moments later. "Karen used some kind of master key. Is that legal?" I immediately left work, calling my supervisor to explain the emergency. The 30-minute drive home felt like hours as I imagined the damage being done to my carefully calibrated systems. My breeding snakes were extremely sensitive to environmental changes and human disturbances, particularly Athena, who was so close to laying her clutch of eggs. When I finally reached my driveway, the HOA inspection team was already gone, but what I found was far worse than a simple inspection. The shed door was unlocked and slightly ajar, a catastrophic breach for a climate-controlled environment. I rushed inside and was met with chaos. The main temperature controller had been reset, now reading 76 degrees instead of the critical 82 degrees needed for the breeding area. Humidity levels had dropped significantly. Several habitat enclosures had been moved, their heat mats unplugged. My meticulously organized breeding records had been scattered across the workbench, many pages crumpled or stained with water. Most disturbing of all, a significant portion of my equipment racks had been pushed against the wall to make room for stacks of plastic storage containers. I stared in disbelief at the labels: HOA holiday decorations, community event supplies, pool party equipment. I moved frantically from enclosure to enclosure, checking each snake. Most seemed stressed but physically unharmed. Athena had retreated deep into her hide box, refusing to emerge even when I gently tapped the side of her habitat, an ominous sign for a normally curious snake, especially one so close to laying eggs. As I was documenting the disruption with my phone camera, Michael knocked on the shed door. I tried to tell them they should not touch anything, he said apologetically. But Karen said as HOA president, she had authority to inspect and utilize any structures that violate bylaws. Utilize, I repeated in disbelief. What violation could possibly justify this? She said your shed exceeds the allowed square footage for personal storage and claimed some obscure bylaw about community access to oversized structures, Michael explained, looking uncomfortable. When she saw all the snake habitats, she seemed almost gleeful, saying she had suspected you were running an unauthorized business. She made a big show of measuring everything and taking photos. Did she mention anything about these storage containers? I asked, gesturing to the HOA supplies now occupying nearly a third of my facility space. Michael nodded grimly. She announced the space was underutilized and perfect for community storage needs. When one of the other board members questioned whether they could just move your stuff, she said, and I quote, "He is in clear violation. The HOA has authority to repurpose non-compliant structures for community benefit." I sank onto my work stool, trying to process what had happened. This was not an inspection. This was an unauthorized seizure of my property. Worse, it was an invasion that had placed years of work and the lives of my animals in jeopardy. The temperature fluctuations alone could cause breeding females to reabsorb their eggs or abandon them entirely. As I began the urgent work of restoring proper environmental conditions, I discovered that several crucial pieces of equipment had been unplugged for so long that they required complete recalibration. The automated feeding schedule had been interrupted. The record-keeping system that tracked each snake's health, feeding, and breeding history had been compromised. What had taken me years to perfect had been carelessly dismantled in less than an hour by someone who clearly had no understanding of or respect for the delicate ecosystem I had created. As I worked frantically to restore order, a sinking feeling grew in my stomach. This was not a one-time event. This was the beginning of a systematic attempt to force me to abandon my breeding program, or perhaps even my home. The full impact of the unauthorized inspection became apparent over the next several days. The sudden temperature fluctuations had created a cascade of health issues throughout my collection. 2 juvenile ball pythons refused food, showing the classic symptoms of stress-induced illness, defensive posturing, regurgitation attempts, and excessive hiding. Most concerning was Athena's condition. The disruption had occurred at the most critical phase of her breeding cycle. By the 3rd morning after the invasion, I found her coiled around eggs that had been laid prematurely. Instead of the firm, healthy eggs I had anticipated, these were soft-shelled and already beginning to collapse, clear evidence of severe stress causing a premature laying event. Years of careful genetic selection and thousands of dollars in potential offspring lost in a single night. I documented everything meticulously, photographing the damaged eggs, recording temperature data that showed the dangerous fluctuations, videoing the pythons displaying stress behaviors. My breeding logs clearly indicated the expected laying date for Athena, proving the premature egg-laying was directly connected to the environmental disruption. With this evidence compiled, I sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, detailing the unauthorized entry, the tampering with specialized equipment, and the resulting damage to my breeding stock. I included an itemized list of the damages, conservatively estimated at over $7,000, along with copies of my business license and permits proving the legitimacy of my operation. Karen's response arrived via certified mail less than 48 hours later. Far from acknowledging any wrongdoing, the letter doubled down on their position. It cited Bylaw 1247 regarding structures exceeding 120 square feet and claimed such structures were subject to community utilization review. There was no acknowledgement of the damage caused, no response to my evidence of permits and licensing, and no apology for entering without my presence. The final paragraph delivered the most devastating news. Following our inspection, the board has determined that your shed constitutes an oversized structure that has been partially requisitioned for community storage purposes. A new access protocol has been established requiring 48-hour written notice for owner entry. All entry must be supervised by an HOA representative to ensure community property is not disturbed. I read the letter 3 times, unable to fully process the audacity of this response. They had not only damaged my property and injured my animals, but were now claiming the right to restrict my access to my own shed on my own property. I immediately contacted the HOA office to schedule an emergency meeting with the full board. The receptionist sounded apologetic, but informed me that Karen had left instructions that my case had been decided and that no further meetings would be scheduled to discuss the matter. That evening, I went door to door in my neighborhood, trying to rally support from other homeowners. Most expressed sympathy but were reluctant to openly oppose Karen. Several mentioned receiving violation notices themselves and feared escalation if they spoke against the board. Mr. Garcia confided that his request for a reasonable timeline to fix his fence had been denied, resulting in a $100 daily fine. The Wilson family had been threatened with legal action over their unapproved vegetable garden. Karen had systematically intimidated the entire community into compliance. Having exhausted community support options, I began researching legal resources. I spent hours reviewing state property laws, HOA regulations, and animal welfare statutes. It quickly became apparent that the HOA had overstepped their authority on multiple fronts, but fighting them would require legal expertise I did not possess. The situation reached a breaking point the following Wednesday. I had taken a sick day to transport one of my stressed pythons to a specialized reptile veterinarian. The snake had not eaten for 10 days and showed signs of respiratory infection, a direct result of the environmental disruption. The vet visit took longer than expected, with the doctor prescribing a course of antibiotics and providing documentation that linked the snake's condition directly to stress and improper environmental conditions. When I returned home late that afternoon, I found 2 HOA board members supervising the delivery of additional storage containers to my shed. But what stopped me cold was the sight of my shed door. The locks had been changed. A laminated notice had been attached to the door stating, "Access restricted, HOA property, for entry request form, contact management office." I approached the board members, veterinary documentation in hand, trying to maintain my composure. I need immediate access to check on my animals. One is already under veterinary care, and the others need monitoring. The younger board member looked uncomfortable, but the older one, a man named Richard who had been elected alongside Karen, stood firm. All access requests must be submitted in writing 48 hours in advance. The notice clearly states the procedure. "These are living creatures," I explained, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They require daily care and monitoring. This is not only inhumane but illegal under state animal welfare laws." "You should have considered that before violating HOA regulations," Richard replied coldly. "Perhaps this will motivate you to find more appropriate housing for your hobby." Through the window of my own shed, I could see more HOA storage containers now occupying nearly half the available space. My snake habitats had been pushed even closer together, disrupting the careful spacing that allowed for proper heat gradient management. The humidity gauge visible from the window showed readings far below acceptable levels. I returned to my house and immediately called the non-emergency police line to report the unauthorized changing of locks on my property. The officer who responded seemed sympathetic, but explained that without a court order, this was considered a civil matter between me and the HOA. He recommended I contact a lawyer specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. That night I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by HOA bylaws, property laws, and veterinary reports. Through my window, I could see the shed where my breeding program slowly deteriorated behind locks for which I had no key. Condensation formed on the windows as the environmental systems struggled to maintain proper conditions in the increasingly crowded space. The sense of violation was profound. This was not just about property rights or even about the financial investment my breeding program represented. These were living creatures dependent on my care, now being used as pawns in Karen's campaign to assert her authority over the neighborhood. The casual cruelty of preventing access to animals in my care revealed a depth of calculated malice that left me shaken. I realized then that standard approaches would not resolve this situation. Karen had systematically insulated herself from normal channels of accountability. She had intimidated the community, manipulated HOA rules, and established herself as an authority beyond question. To protect my animals and my property rights, I would need to approach this problem differently. I needed a strategy that would expose not just the violation of rules, but the fundamental character of the person behind these actions. 3 days after the locks were changed, I finally received approved access to my own shed. The HOA representative who supervised my visit remained present the entire time, watching suspiciously as I checked each habitat and attempted to restore proper conditions. My request to move the storage containers was denied, with the representative citing board-approved placement that could not be altered. What I found inside confirmed my worst fears. The disrupted environment and restricted access had proven fatal for several of my snakes. A young albino corn snake, the result of 2 years of selective breeding, lay lifeless in its habitat, its specialized genetic traits lost forever. A pair of hatchling king snakes had succumbed to respiratory infections. And most devastating of all, Athena's prematurely laid eggs showed no signs of development. All 9 embryos had perished. I documented everything with clinical precision, photographing each loss, recording environmental readings, and noting the timestamps of all HOA interventions. The supervising representative shifted uncomfortably as I documented the deaths, but offered no comment beyond reminding me that my approved access period would end in 20 minutes. That evening, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by the evidence of destruction. 3 small containers held the bodies of the snakes that had not survived. My breeding records documented years of careful selection to develop the genetic lines now lost. Temperature logs showed the wild fluctuations that had occurred since the HOA takeover. The financial loss was substantial, but the loss of living creatures under my care cut much deeper. Something fundamental shifted inside me that night. The initial shock and disbelief had burned away, replaced by a cold, clear determination. This was no longer about negotiation or compromise. This was about justice and accountability. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the office of Patricia Menendez, an attorney specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. Her office was small but immaculately organized, with framed news articles highlighting her successful cases against overreaching homeowners associations. "Your situation is unfortunately not unique," Patricia explained after reviewing my documentation, "but it is one of the more egregious HOA overreaches I have encountered. They have violated multiple state laws, including property rights statutes, animal welfare regulations, and even their own governing documents." "Can we get an emergency injunction to restore my access?" I asked, hope rising for the first time in days. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "We can and should pursue legal remedies. However, I should warn you that HOA litigation often becomes protracted and expensive. Even with a strong case, we could be looking at months of legal maneuvering. I do not have months, I replied. More of my animals will die if this continues. There is another approach we might consider alongside legal action, Patricia suggested. In my experience, HOAs like yours are particularly vulnerable to public accountability. They operate in shadows, counting on homeowner intimidation and apathy. When their actions are exposed to community scrutiny, they often retreat rather than face public backlash. This insight aligned with what I had observed about Karen. Her power derived from creating an appearance of authority and propriety. Her real estate business depended on her reputation in the community. Her HOA tyranny thrived because it occurred in private, one homeowner at a time. Over the next week, I devoted myself to building a comprehensive case. I researched Karen's history and discovered she had employed similar tactics in 2 previous neighborhoods, forcing out homeowners whose properties or activities she deemed undesirable. Several former residents provided statements describing experiences strikingly similar to mine. I reviewed every HOA bylaw and discovered that the community utilization provision Karen had cited did not actually exist in our governing documents. The board had no authority to requisition private property, change locks, or restrict access to structures on private land. I compiled all documentation of my breeding operations' legitimacy, business license, specialized permits, safety certifications, and professional association memberships. I created a detailed timeline of events, supported by security camera footage, text messages, emails, and photographs. Most importantly, I gathered documentation of the animal welfare violations. The veterinarian who had treated my sick python provided a sworn statement linking the snake's condition directly to environmental disruptions. A reptile breeding expert from the state university assessed my documentation and provided a professional opinion confirming that the deaths resulted directly from improper environmental conditions caused by the unauthorized access and restrictions. Throughout this process, I carefully avoided direct confrontation with Karen or the HOA board. I submitted access requests through official channels, documented all interactions, and maintained a posture of procedural compliance. When board members entered my shed, they had no idea I was methodically building a case that would eventually dismantle their authority. Patricia advised me to identify potential allies within the community. Michael, who had witnessed the unauthorized entry, agreed to provide a statement. Mrs. Wilson, whose garden had been targeted, offered to share her documentation of similar HOA overreach. Even the HOA receptionist, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's tactics, discreetly provided copies of board meeting minutes that contradicted official communications. As my evidence mounted, I recognized that Karen had one significant vulnerability that could be leveraged effectively. During her initial inspection, her reaction to my snake habitats had revealed an intense, irrational fear of reptiles. This phobia, combined with her obsession with appearances and control, formed the centerpiece of my strategy. I did not plan to confront Karen directly or engage in personal attacks. Instead, I would create a situation where her own actions and reactions would reveal her true character to the entire community. The HOA general meeting scheduled for the following month would provide the perfect forum. Patricia helped me prepare a meticulously structured presentation that would walk community members through the timeline of events, the legal violations, and the consequences of the board's actions. We prepared comprehensive information packets for every homeowner, containing copies of relevant bylaws, documentation of violations, and expert assessments of damages. I arranged for the veterinarian to attend the meeting, prepared to explain the medical consequences of the environmental disruptions. I secured commitments from neighbors who had witnessed key events, including Michael, who had seen the unauthorized entry and lock changing. Most importantly, I prepared myself mentally for what would be an intensely public confrontation. I practiced maintaining a calm, factual presentation style, even when discussing the emotional impact of losing animals under my care. I rehearsed responses to potential objections or interruptions. I prepared myself to remain focused on accountability rather than revenge. The evening before the HOA meeting, I sat in my living room looking out at the shed that had been converted from a passion project into a battleground. Inside that structure, my remaining snakes struggled to survive in increasingly hostile conditions. Behind new locks I had not authorized, living creatures suffered because one person had decided her authority mattered more than their well-being. Tomorrow would change everything, not through threats or intimidation, but through the simple, devastating power of truth presented in a forum where it could not be ignored or dismissed. Karen had built her power on manipulation and fear. I would dismantle it with transparency and facts. I checked my presentation materials one final time, confirming that each document was in order, each photograph clearly labeled, each statement properly signed. This was not just about reclaiming my property or saving my breeding program. This had become about something more fundamental, establishing that no position of authority, no matter how small, should be used to bully, intimidate, or harm others. The community center parking lot was overflowing on the night of the HOA general meeting. My strategic scheduling of allied neighbors to spread word about important revelations had succeeded in drawing the largest attendance in the association's history. Residents who had never before attended a meeting arrived early to secure seats, curious about the rumors of mismanagement and abuse of power. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled start, accompanied by Patricia, the veterinarian Dr. Rivera, and Michael. We quietly distributed sealed information packets to each seat, comprehensive dossiers containing evide, NCE, bylaws, expert opinions, and photographs documenting the entire saga. Each packet remained closed, with instructions not to open until directed during the presentation. Karen entered the room with her usual confident stride, faltering momentarily when she saw the unprecedented crowd and the materials on each chair. She quickly composed herself and began the meeting with her typical brisk efficiency, rushing through routine business items and budget approvals. When she reached the open comments section of the agenda, typically a brief formality before adjournment, I raised my hand. Karen's expression tightened as she recognized me, but with dozens of witnesses present, she could not reasonably deny a homeowner the standard 3-minute comment period. The chair recognizes the homeowner from 347 Maple Drive, she announced with forced politeness. Please remember the 3-minute limitation on all comments. I approached the podium at the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the projector as I spoke. Thank you, Madam President. Before I begin my comments, I would like to ask all homeowners to open the information packets provided at your seats. The sound of dozens of envelopes being opened filled the room. Karen started to object, but fell silent as she watched residents pulling out the professionally prepared documentation. I am here tonight to address a serious matter affecting not only my property rights, but potentially those of every homeowner in this community. I began, my voice steady and clear. What you are looking at is evidence of unauthorized entry to private property, illegal seizure of a properly permitted structure, animal welfare violations resulting in preventable deaths, and falsification of HOA records to justify these actions. The projection screen displayed my business license, breeding permits, and property documentation side by side, with the HOA violation notices claiming unauthorized usage. I have operated a fully licensed, legally permitted reptile breeding business from my property for 7 years, I continued. Every aspect of this operation has been inspected, approved, and certified by appropriate county and state authorities. I clicked to the next slide, showing security camera footage of Karen using a master key to enter my shed without permission. On April 15th of this year, 3 board members entered my property without permission or proper notice, using unauthorized master keys to access my private shed. This entry was not only a violation of property rights, but initiated a series of events that resulted in significant property damage and the death of several animals under my care. The room had grown completely silent. Even Karen seemed momentarily speechless as the evidence mounted on the screen before her. I moved methodically through the timeline of events, supported by documentation at every step, the environmental disruptions, the increasingly restrictive access protocols, the installation of unauthorized locks, and finally, the deaths of animals that resulted directly from these actions. Dr. Rivera approached the podium when called, providing expert testimony on the medical evidence. The respiratory infections, premature egg laying, and subsequent deaths documented in these animals are consistent with acute environmental stress caused by the conditions described. In my professional opinion, these deaths were preventable and resulted directly from unauthorized disruption of the specialized habitats. Throughout the presentation, Karen attempted several times to interrupt, her voice growing increasingly shrill. This is not an appropriate use of comment time. These allegations are unfounded and potentially slanderous. Patricia stepped forward at this point. Every statement made tonight is supported by documented evidence, sworn testimony, or expert opinion. Nothing presented constitutes slander under state law. I would encourage the board to focus on addressing the substantive issues rather than attempting to silence legitimate homeowner concerns. The strategic positioning of allies throughout the room ensured that when Karen attempted to cut the presentation short, multiple voices called for it to continue. Her increasingly defensive reactions only served to